Welcome back to Face the Nation. We continue our interview with former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. So the world is watching these trade talks between the U.S. and China, and there seems to be this brinksmanship game over tariffs underway. Does China have an advantage over us?
Well, the Chinese have an advantage because they have a strategy, and we don't. They have set goals, they have a strategy for achieving those goals, and we really don't have a strategy. We haven't had a strategy in quite a while.
You don't think the Trump administration has a broader plan for China?
I don't think basically that recent U.S. administrations have had a strategy for how to deal with China long term.
Why?
In Washington, I always like to say that long-term planning is a week from Thursday. Washington is so consumed all the time by the issue of the moment that it's very difficult to get senior people to set aside the time to think about where do we want to be in 5 years with this country or that country. That's what the National Security Council and its staff is supposed to do in terms of bringing together all of the elements of the government to figure out where we want to be. But recent administrations, I think, have not been able to do that very well.
We've seen there are a number of hot spots right now attracting attention from the Trump administration. Iran in particular. The U.S. just sent B-52s, redirected an aircraft carrier to the region. It's supposed to be a warning to Iran that the U.S. will defend itself. But how do you interpret this sort of muscular response?
In a way, we're kind of returning to a presence that we had when the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were at their height. The theocracy in Tehran really is hostile to the United States all the way down to the core. And so trying to figure out how to deal with these guys and to warn them not to take some rash action that would precipitate a response by the United States, I think is an important element. I think the administration is sending that signal, but it isn't just the fact we walked away from the Iranian nuclear deal. This is a more deeply embedded rivalry and dislike between these two countries.
They would argue they negotiated with the United States, with the world, and the result after that diplomacy was to have the U.S. walk away. What is their incentive now to talk?
What the agreement did not address was their testing of ballistic missiles of increasing range, and it did not address at all their meddling and interference in the Middle East, their support for Hamas and so on. Now, those are the kinds of things that actually are creating a lot of turbulence in the Middle East, and so getting a handle on that kind of behavior seems to me important. I believe the original agreement had some very deep flaws, but once it was signed, I think it was a mistake to walk away from it. We should have then used various other pressures to address these other issues.
So that was a strategic misstep by the Trump administration?
I think so, in part because it ended up isolating us as well as the Iranians.
We heard this week from Iran this threat that they may not comply. They have been, and the rest of the world stayed in the deal. What happens if this thing actually does fall apart?
I think moving ahead like this for Iran just puts them deeper in a box, because then it'll not only be the United States that has reimposed sanctions, it'll put the Europeans in a position where they have to do that as well.
So you think the Iranians are bluffing?
No, they may be making a mistake, which may be even worse.
We spoke recently with Iran's top diplomat, Javad Zarif, and he basically said he thought President Trump was being manipulated by his advisors, particularly John Bolton, along with some U.S. allies. And he seemed to be saying, we're on the path where an accident, a military confrontation of some sort, could happen. Is that where you see us headed?
I think there's that risk, absolutely. I mean, if the Iranians make the mistake of launching an attack in the Persian Gulf on an American warship, or if they carry out an operation against American troops in Iraq or something like that, the administration probably won't have any alternative but to retaliate.
But do you think that there is that manipulation happening to create the conditions for that?
I don't believe that the president is being manipulated, and I don't believe his advisors are trying to maneuver him into a position that provokes an incident with the Iranians that could then be expanded. I don't believe that.
It sounds like you're saying miscalculation, though, is still a possibility.
I think it's
here.
a very real risk right now, yes.
You're a former Secretary of Defense, former CIA director. Do you still speak with foreign leaders?
Sometimes, not all that often, but sometimes.
President Trump said that John Kerry should be prosecuted under the Logan Act because he still talks to foreign leaders, specifically Iran's foreign minister. What do you make of that?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, no one has ever been prosecuted under the Logan Act. And I think it's been in effect since World War I.
So you're laughing
I
about
think,
this.
I mean, this is not going to happen. And American politicians and former leaders talk to other leaders all the time.
So these accusations from the president that it is because the former Secretary of State is interfering, that it's keeping Iran from negotiating, you think the president's just wrong?
I don't believe that.
And there's nothing wrong with it in your view?
Well, I think it's a matter of judgment. And I think trying to hold a negotiation, if you will, with a foreign leader when you're out of power is a mistake. I think that's a mistake in judgment. There's only one president at a time, and negotiations with other governments ought to be left to the administration, to the president.
North Korea, another hot spot. Do you think the president's on the right track?
Under his President Trump's three predecessors, all tried to negotiate with the North Koreans and all failed. I thought that the president's decision to reach out to Kim Jong-un and offer a personal meeting, sure, there were risks, but I thought it was a bold stroke that might create an environment where there could actually be progress toward getting limitations on the North Korean nuclear program. I believe that the North Koreans will never completely denuclearize.
The proposal in Hanoi.
Was basically the same strategy that he's followed with Trump's predecessors. You know, we'll do a little and you do some. We'll do a little and you do more.
So you don't think he's serious about diplomacy?
I think Kim, I think he is, but I think he's got a different set of objectives. I like to say over the years of negotiations, the nuclear facility at Yongbyon has been opened and closed so many times, it ought to have a revolving door.
So that's not a serious offer by North Korea when they put it on the table.
They've done this before.
So the president was right to walk away?
I think he was. I think he was because, now, I think they're unrealistic in believing that they can get complete denuclearization. So the question is, if the North won't give up all of its nuclear weapons, are other limitations worth pursuing? Mm-hmm. And what's the alternative to pursuing those other alternatives?
Well, North Korea hasn't handed over its weapons inventory. They haven't dismantled their missiles. They haven't broken down any part of their nuclear program. So how long do you keep talking before you say this just isn't going to work?
As long as there's no nuclear testing, it's probably worth keeping the door open. But at some point, people have to realize that if you just drag this thing out, it's not going to lead to anything.
We'll be right back with some analysis from our panel. We turn now to our panel for some analysis. Susan Glasser covers the presidency and foreign policy for The New Yorker, and David Nakamura covers the White House for The Washington Post. Good to have you here. It was interesting to have Bob Gates sort of take us around the world. All these hot spots seem to be bubbling up this week, a lot on the Trump administration's plate. David, from your reporting with the North Koreans and this round of testing, what are they looking for here? Is it a third summit? What are they trying to pressure?
The North Korean strategy has long been, if they're not getting the kind of attention from the United States that they want, they act this way and they start to sort of press the boundaries. Now we're seeing, since the breakdown of the talks in Hanoi without a deal, increasing signals that Kim Jong-un is frustrated. He wants Donald Trump to re-engage. How they re-engage is not clear. The U.S. side says they've sent feelers to Pyongyang and they're not hearing anything back. And which side sort of budges and says, okay, we're ready to renegotiate, reopen this, is unclear. And I think what you're seeing now, both with the tests by the North that have not gone so far as to force Trump to say that they're violating this ban on ballistic missile testing that he's so trumpeted as an achievement. But not just that, but now there's a seizure of the United States of a North Korea cargo ship suggesting that the North is trying to get around the economic sanctions. This is leading to greater tensions, and how they sort of break through that to get back to the negotiating table is not clear, especially at a time when Trump is also engaged in this trade war with China, and he's trying to keep the Chinese support on this sanctions regime.
And the UN said that 40% of the North Korean population is near starving right now. I mean, they're really getting squeezed by these sanctions. Does delivering food aid violate the maximum pressure campaign, Susan? Does the president have a way around this?
Well, I think he does. And the other thing is that President Trump has shown that he really won't be bound by many of the constraints anyways that in the past. He's not, as you know, one of those people who in his negotiations insists on consistency at the expense of all other virtues, right? And so in this situation, I agree with David that the North Koreans are really looking to pressure the United States in some way back to the table. Kim Jong-un is essentially launching these missiles. He's given a deadline, interestingly, of the end of the year for there to be some sort of progress here. And, you know, what's striking is that President Trump, although he's suffered what looks like an embarrassment, the collapse of this summit, his theory of the case that the North Koreans would respond to his pressure differently than the 3 previous U.S. administrations. That hasn't paid off either. Trump has been pretty unwavering in his very, very public desire to go back to the table as well. So I think that, you know, once again, we're seeing it's much easier to blow up deals than it is to make them, despite Trump believing that he's a great deal maker.
And David, while the president has said these short-range missile tests don't violate his sense of trust with Kim Jong-un, that's got to make Japan and South Korea a little nervous.
Absolutely. You just had the Prime Minister of Japan here a few weeks ago. He's taken a really hard line on these talks, in contrast to what's happening with the president of South Korea. So there's a split among U.S. allies. Tokyo and Seoul do not see this the same way. It's certainly concerning for the Japanese that they're relaunching these sort of shorter-range missiles, projectiles, new weapons that Kim Jong-un talks about, and it's unclear, you know, what. But it also sends a signal that the North Korea is continuing to make progress on its overall weapons system. And this is something that, as this thing drags out, there's a sense that the North Koreans, of course, they want the end to sanctions. There are, you know, major issues with the economy, and that's troubling for Kim Jong-un and his long-term future. But I think over time, there's the idea that North Korea likes these talks because they continue to drag this out in a way that gives them more time.
Susan, on Iran, that was another flashpoint this week. The Pentagon sent anti-missile battery, B-52 bombers, an amphibious ship, combat helicopters, aircraft carrier. What is this buildup aimed at?
Well, you know, look, you talk about maximum pressure. I think that is the goal right now of the administration. But again, on North Korea, on Iran, we haven't talked about Venezuela yet, China. What you see, I think, across a broad number of fronts is that people are so eager to find a Trump doctrine in foreign policy. There is no Trump doctrine in foreign policy, right? And, you know, if you will lose yourself all day long trying to figure out why are they tough and talking about human rights here, but on the other hand, with North Korea, talking about embracing a dictator. In Iran, we're looking at 1 year after the president blew up the Iran deal, walked away from this accord that was negotiated not only by the United States, but its key allies and partners. So you could say, well, we're just seeing the inevitable unraveling of that previous agreement. That's what's happening right now. But I think that it really connects back to the great uncertainty about what the Trump administration policy is in the Middle East more broadly, right? You have this situation in Syria where the Iranians are there on the side of the Syrian regime. You have the Russians there as well. Interestingly, you could say that President Trump has a very hardline policy in many of these places, and the only question is whether he himself actually supports it.
It's a great point, because I was going to say that, you know, Trump undercuts his aide so often. We've seen that from the start of the administration. They're speaking out of two sides of their mouth, and there was the idea that Trump is building the maximum pressure on Iran like he did with Pyongyang, and the goal being that Trump himself would then get to the negotiating table with the Iranians. And Trump himself said, call me. He said, call me right after John Bolton was suggesting there was a new hard line in place. And so, you know, what I think is interesting also in the end of the Iran deal on the nuclear weapons, you know, the allies have been cut out of the U.S. policy and the U.S. approach, and Trump believes himself to be the great deal maker. Only I can fix this. You've seen him do that with North Korea, now with Iran potentially, and of course with China, where he got a lot of kudos for a harder line policy on Chinese economic practices, what a lot of allies believe is predatory, but he's cut out the allies in sort of building the pressure on China and even negotiating.
I thought it was interesting talking to Bob Gates that he said he stands by his assessment that Joe Biden has been wrong in foreign policy for 40 years. But then he pointed out the Democratic candidates, no one's really articulating their view of what America should be doing. So all the problems you're laying out may get handed off to another commander-in-chief in 2020. Where do we pick up?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, you have President Trump, to the extent there is a unifying theme, it often has been up until now sort of anything but Obama's foreign policy, and that was usually a pretty sure way to predict the otherwise unpredictable, right? So if President Trump saw a place and a way to undo something that Obama did, for example, the Iran nuclear deal, or to achieve something he felt Obama did not, for example, a breakthrough with North Korea, he would do it. It's very hard after 2 years, after 4 years, to make the argument that your foreign policy doctrine is just to do what the other guy didn't do. Democrats would face that problem as well. There would be enormous. President Trump is obviously extremely unpopular with the Democratic base. So simply arguing that you would do differently than Trump may be enough of a foreign policy argument. Generally speaking, American voters aren't looking for a consistent worldview and doctrine from their presidential candidates as much as they are focused, understandably, on the economy and what's happening here at home. But look, the bottom line is that it may suit President Trump to have Joe Biden as the nominee and to be able to once again to say, well, at least I'm cleaning up the messes from Barack Obama. Biden would be like that.
Well, we want to talk about the challenge the U.S. faces from China with former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson. That's up next. We're now joined by Henry Paulson, Treasury Secretary for George W. Bush. He was the administration's point person on the 2008 financial crisis and also led previous U.S. trade talks with China. It's great to have you here in studio. You know China's leadership very well, both from your time as Treasury Secretary and building out business for Goldman Sachs there for many, many years. How do you expect China to retaliate against the U.S. since these talks seem to have stalled?
Well, Margaret, let me begin by saying Happy Mother's Day and to my mom, Mariana, and my wife, Wendy. Now, I'm not going to predict how China is going to respond. They've been very restrained to date. They clearly want a deal and need a deal, as does the United States. No one wins a trade war. So I'm expecting, a fairly restrained response.
Well, you had one of the president's top economic advisors, Larry Kudlow, on air today saying that the Chinese came to talks this week and then backslid on some of the things they'd previously agreed to. Why the miscalculation?
Well, there's often miscalculations, right? People misunderstand China. They've got a different political system than ours, but they've got politics, they've got vested interests. But, the bigger picture here is this is a deal can be very good for the United States and very good for China. The Trump administration has been working very hard to do something which I think would make a big difference for American workers, for the American people, in terms of getting more balanced trade, in terms of protecting IPR, in terms of breaking down some big structural barriers to competition. And China's got plenty of problems themselves. They've got an inefficient financial system, inefficient state-owned enterprises, massive misallocations of capital. So their reformers know that if they're going to grow at an acceptable level, they need some structural changes. So this, I think, is been a missed opportunity for both countries. But I believe, and I think the overriding point here, the big picture is, if and when this deal is done, and I'm an optimist, I think it'll get done, the underlying tensions are still going to be there, because the stakes are much bigger than a trade war. The basic economic problem is still going to exist.
You've put up huge warning signs around this. You said you fear an economic Cold War, an economic iron wall.
Yeah, I talked about an economic iron curtain. And the reason I did is this, Margaret, that as I said, the stakes are much bigger than a trade war. This is a battle between two countries to set the standards for the technologies of the future, the technologies which are going to bolster economic growth and competitiveness around the world. And so the fundamental issue is technology. Okay, that's where the battleground is. And technology has blurred the lines between national security and economic competitiveness. And so, I think it's vitally important we protect our national security. But a growing and important part of trade is technology related. And so the real risk is that both countries, through their actions, will throw up or create an economic iron wall, which means we'll be decoupling global supply chains, right? We'll be having two systems with incompatible standards and rules. And so as I look at it, the defining strength of America is innovation. And we need to protect our technology, need to protect our innovation. But if we close ourselves off from other innovative economies and entrepreneurs, we jeopardize our leadership position in the world, and we're much less attractive as a destination for foreign investment.
So you seem to be saying the moment is ripe for this deal.
Yes.
You're optimistic, but you don't like tariffs. That's the president's main tool here. Is this going to damage the U.S. economy?
Well, so you're darn right, I don't like tariffs. Why don't I like them? Because they're a tax on the American consumer. But I see an even more perverse effect with tariffs. Those who do us the great honor of investing in America, of doing business with our companies and suppliers, do so because we've always had predictable, reliable economic policies. Tariffs jeopardize that. But now we see a situation where Republicans and Democrats and many international companies are applauding for tariffs if they're used to get concessions from China. And why is that? The reason is because we're in a tough spot in negotiations. Our tariffs are either non-existent or very low. So how do you put pressure on other countries to act? How do you put pressure on China? We don't have very many good tools. So that's why they prefer tariffs. Now,
Is it going to hurt us economically?
But I'll say this. I would prefer the tactic of working with our allies to put pressure. But I got to admit that's an imperfect tool, right? Because our allies aren't very tough when it comes to negotiating with China. But will it hurt us? I tell you, if this persists too long, it will. Okay, there will be a cost to it. We're trying to accomplish something that's very important in terms of opening up the Chinese economy, but there's a cost. And as strong as our economy is right now, and it is very, very strong, as strong as it is, I'll tell you, if...
Mr. Secretary, we have to leave it there. I'm so sorry. We're running up against a hard break. We will be right back. Thank you all for watching. To all the moms, including my own mother, my mother-in-law, happy Mother's Day. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.